Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes renting fast if you're the car chick. Now, here she is.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Straight Shift. We're going to be talking about divorce and cars today. And I know nobody really ever wants to talk about divorce, but sadly, almost half of all marriages in the US end in divorce or separation. And because this is 2020 and we've got COVID and people have been stuck together for months, I'm afraid the divorce rates are probably going to be going up. But in my practice, the fair number of my clients over the years have been women who have either recently gotten divorced or are currently going through a divorce. And some of them are in good shape financially, but maybe they haven't bought a car on their own in a really long time, or maybe ever. For others, they may be in the unfortunate situation where the divorce is causing them some headaches in their car situation, whether it's legal issues, financial issues, or just the logistics of the titling of the cars. So when I'm working with a divorced client or a soon-to-be divorced client, I sometimes have to reach out to their attorney to talk through some of these issues to make sure that I'm helping them to make the right decisions that's going to put them in the best possible position in their divorce. And sometimes I have questions. So I call up, one of my attorney buddies and say, okay, so what do we need to do here? What are the legalities? So today I wanted to have one of those attorney buddies on as my guest. So please welcome Lindsey Easterling of Easterling Family Law. Lindsey, thank you so much for being here.
I'm excited to be here. This is going to be fun.
Well, as fun as it can be talking about an issue like divorce, but
You have to have a sick and twisted humor about it if you're going to survive this type of career long term.
I can understand that. How long have you been practicing family law?
I was just saying to someone, it's been 11 years that I've been a family law attorney. That's crazy to think.
Wow. Now, I know you're in North Carolina. Is that the only state where you're licensed, or are you licensed in multiple states?
I'm licensed in Michigan, but I haven't practiced there in over 6 years. So it's been a long time. I recall some of the law, but I tell people I'm licensed there and maintain my license, but I wouldn't give much advice to anyone in Michigan, mostly just North Carolina.
And that makes sense. So the things we're going to talk through today, we may be discussing how the law applies in North Carolina, but people be aware, if you're going through one of these situations, you do need to work with an attorney that's licensed in your state because, the law varies by state just to make our lives difficult and make it more complicated. But
Absolutely.
we're going to talk about, at least kind of at a high level, some of the scenarios that we encounter and what to do in those situations, and also what you can do to avoid getting yourself into those situations in the first place, because the best defense is always a good offense. So,
Yeah.
Lindsey, one of the things that I typically encounter when I'm working with a client who's going through a divorce is they're trying to figure out how do they split up the assets. And I have to remind them that a car is not necessarily an asset. It may also be a liability. So how do they decide who gets which car?
Well, generally, we're looking at a lot of times it is a liability unless they have it paid off. And even then, if it's paid off, it still might not have much value. So what we're trying to figure out in the way I describe it to clients is we have to figure out the entire marital pot. So what goes into this marital pot? All of the different assets. That's your house. That's your retirement. That's your debt. That's your credit cards. That is your car and maybe a car loan. And then we're dividing all of the assets that are in this marital pot equitably, which is usually 50-50. So do you get the car with the debt? Maybe. Or do you get the car without the debt? Maybe. Or is there even an option for that? So a lot of times it's who can afford it, who has possession of it and uses it. Most of the time we're thinking logically like that. But there's a lot that goes into, should I get this car? Do I even want this car? And can I make it mine after it's given to me? Can I even afford it? So I think it's a deeper question.
Yeah, and I would agree because a lot of the times I've had attorneys reach out to me over the years to say, "Hey, can you help me figure out what the true equity position is on this car?" Because I've seen a lot of people fighting over, "Well, I want the Mercedes. No, I want the Mercedes." Well, if you're $8,000 upside down on the Mercedes, then maybe you don't want the Mercedes. Maybe you should take the Toyota that you have positive equity in, and maybe you can sell that and buy yourself a Mercedes, but don't necessarily fight over the car based on which one is newer or has lower miles. You have to look at what is the equity position. Do you have positive equity, meaning that you don't owe any money on the car, you own it outright, or you owe less than what the market value of the car is? Or like most people, especially if you bought the car within the last couple of years, you may be upside down. The car may not be worth as much if you sell it as is owed on it. So I see that happen all the time.
Yeah, it's really difficult to sometimes take the emotion out of it. Like, I've always wanted this car. This was my dream car. And to kind of educate, like, I get it. And I get that you achieved your dreams and things are changing. And now we might need to not have the dream car so you can afford it. So yeah, the value that people put on cars is sometimes monetary, sometimes it's an emotional value, and that's sometimes hard to kind of wade through those waters as you're determining who gets what. And the logical sense, like the business deal of it when you're talking about a divorce, is hard to come sometimes wrap your mind around.
Yeah, and that's where people like you and me have to be the objective ones to step in and say, okay, reality check, here is where we are. I know that doesn't make you happy, but this is the reality of where we are, and we've got to deal with just the numbers and put the emotions aside. I don't know how you must like act like a therapist half the time, Lindsay.
Someone called me that last week. They're like, gosh, it's like you're a therapist. But I always recommend you should actually hire a therapist because their hourly rate is lower than mine. And they have more tools. My only tool is, yes, I know that hurts. I hear what you're saying. And that's all I got. I got nothing else.
Oh, that's so funny and so true.
Yes.
But a lot of the times there's a challenge that I encounter with the titling issues of the car, because very often the car might be in both of the people's names. And so now you're talking about splitting up the assets. It's not as easy as just, putting in the divorce settlement, who gets what car. The DMV has to be involved, and you have to retitle the car, or if there's a loan on the car, now you've got to try and extract one person off of that loan by refinancing. And then that just opens up a whole new can of worms if there are financial and credit challenges available, or in the situation.
Yeah. I think the titling, if there's not a loan, the titling is somewhat simple, and all you really need is a notary and you need the actual title. So those kind of things I think are pretty simple. I've helped as an attorney. They've come into my office. I'll sign as the notary to transfer the title, and that's pretty easy peasy, but that's not the majority of the situations. To retitle it, if you have a loan, now you're going to the bank to refinance to change the title, and you may not have the credit to refinance. Or like you had said earlier, LeeAnn, you might be underwater. So refinancing this car for 20,000 when it's only worth 15 might not be an option either. Now you're like, so there's so many other things. Oh, I'll just put the car in my name, or that. It's not as simple as just that so many different times.
Right. And with trying to get it refinanced, the banks, when they do a refinance, that is at an interest rate that's higher than if you were just purchasing the car, because they see a refinance as a little bit higher risk.
Yeah.
So now you may be paying a little bit more, even if you can get it refinanced, but they're looking at the loan to value. So like you said, if the car is only worth 15,000, but you're trying to refinance 20,000, you may not be able to do that without throwing a chunk of cash at it to
Yep.
get the loan to value within the parameters that make the bank comfortable, depending on their underwriting strategy as well as your credit profile. And if the car is older, there are a lot of things that go into that. So I agree. It's never an easy thing. And then anytime you get the DMV involved and you have to file paperwork with them, that's just never easy, period.
And then add COVID to it, and you have to get an appointment, and you better make sure you're at the right location for your appointment, or else that can cause a headache too. I've heard horror stories about the DMV that are more horrid than they usually are because of COVID.
Right. And figuring out what the right forms are. You know,
Yeah.
this was not a divorce situation, but years ago when my father passed away suddenly, both of my parents' cars were in my dad's name for the simple fact that my mother did not have the patience to go to the dealership and sit through all of that BS. And
Right.
so she would tell him, I want that color, go get it. And he would go and do his thing because I learned my negotiating skills from my dad. But the problem that happened is when he passed away, and they live in North Carolina, just trying to get the cars retitled in my mother's name was ridiculously difficult and way more difficult than it needed to be, even for me being in the business. So I called the DMV and explained the situation. You know, really simple. My dad died. Cars are in his name. What do we need to do to get them retitled in my mom's name? And they're like, well, you'll need to do a buyer's order and your father will need to sign the car over to your mother. And I said, okay, can we stop and just think about what you said? My father is dead. She's like, well, he's still going to have to sign it. I was like, I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? So I had to escalate up to the DMV manager in Raleigh. And I told him what the sale or the DMV person said. And he's like, yeah, it's honestly the easiest thing is if you just come in and get one of these dealer reassignment of title forms, and that's going to be the quick. I'm like, I have those. We'll do it that way. So it was as if my mother was the first widow in North Carolina that needed to get a car retitled. And
Yeah.
so I can't imagine that in divorce situations it's necessarily any easier, but at least, you know, both parties are hopefully still alive and can sign whatever paperwork. But I thought it was ridiculous.
Well, I mean, I did make it sound easier than it sometimes is, even if you are just retitling, because you do then need the cooperation of both people to retitle it. You both need to sign in front of notaries to transfer the title. And if you have someone who's going to drag their feet or make something difficult or just kind of be a jerk in the situation, it's not going to be as easy as I said it was, even if there isn't refinancing issues or things like that. So yeah, the financial issues are definitely a huge headache, but you're going to have a headache if you have a jerk on the other side as well.
And how often do we have jerks on the other side? I was very fortunate, if you can use that word. You know, my first husband and I divorced very amicably. And fortunately for us, because we both had very good incomes, you know, during our marriage, and his car was in his name, my car was in my name. Everything was already separated, so it was clean, and we didn't have to go through any of that. Plus, we didn't have any animosity in the divorce, and we basically did it ourselves and paid $250 to file some piece of paper and we were done.
Yeah.
So but I see the pain that some of my clients have gone through with the spouse not being cooperative. How often do you see a non-cooperative party in these situations?
I fortunately market to a group of people that want to be amicable in their divorce process. So in my particular firm, I don't see it that often. And even if there is huge animosity and this is not an amicable situation, many times people are going to do easier things like transfer titles pretty seamlessly. But there's been times where you have to get a judge involved that says sign it or you go to jail. And that's very few and far between, but it does happen. So I don't want to minimize the people that are going through that because it's real life. It really does happen. Someone's going to use it as a power and control kind of situation. But for me, it's very few and far between that I would see that kind of withholding of signature to transfer title of a car, but it happens.
But it sounds like there is a legal path to where basically the court orders the spouse to sign the damn papers or we're hauling your butt to jail.
Yeah, and that's important even when you're settling amicably is to give like timelines. So I'll have in my agreements or consent orders or however it is to say, we're going to do this. We're going to transfer the title of the car. We're going to refinance the car into your name alone within 30 days of the agreement or by June 18th or something like that so that there is some deadline, some accountability, and there's always flexibility with that. If you can work like say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize June 18th came so fast. I'm on my way to the DMV right now. Okay, great. human mistake. But
Right.
otherwise, it's, I have this accountability. You had 30 days, you didn't do it. Now I'm going to ask the court to get involved. So I think that's something, I don't know. I work better with deadlines anyway, and I don't think I'm a jerk. So I think like deadlines are probably a healthy thing to have in your agreement if you're going to have something in there.
And that makes sense because yeah, we do get busy, and some of us like to procrastinate. So I'm always having to give myself deadlines pretty much on everything. So
Right. So just for the human concept of it, I mean, we should have deadlines.
definitely, and I hate to see the financial issues, but one of the things that I see frequently is because when two people are married and they're both contributing income to that marriage, or one of them is maybe contributing a lot more than the other, but it's still your cost of living when you're together tends to be less because you're sharing the housing expenses and the utilities and things like that. And so you might be able to afford a nicer car when you have someone to share your overall living expenses with, but now you get divorced and all of a sudden, that $600 a month car payment that was perfectly doable while you were married suddenly isn't so doable anymore. And so I see a lot of times where like, oh gosh, well, we've got to sell these cars. We, can't afford them on our own, but we're upside down. And so there's just all these challenges to just the fact that you're now moving from one household to two households.
Yeah, I see that a lot. I mean, I have cases where um, they just bought a brand new car right before they decided it was this, I'm done. I'm definitely done with this marriage, but now I have a $600 car payment, and this is my only car. I can't afford this because now I have to pay rent somewhere else. What do I do, Lindsay? How do I handle this? There's so many different ways, and a lot of times none of them are good. So
No,
one,
because very likely if they just bought it, they're massively upside down unless they put a good sized down payment on it, which most people don't do anymore.
no, and you don't think about, okay, so when I'm making this payment and I can afford it, but now I'm living a new lifestyle and I'm going to either pay for my car, or I'm going to put food on my table, or I'm going to make my rent on time. Those are like really stressful decisions. And when the alternative is I'm going to turn in my car and have a loss, like still be paying a debt on something that I'm not even benefiting from because I don't have the car anymore, or I'm getting a lower payment on a car, but I have negative equity on this car because I turned in the higher payment car. So there's so much to kind of think about, and none of them are easy, and that's really hard to kind of explain to people. I realize this was the plan, and plans have changed, and your situation isn't going to be easy. This is going to be kind of digging out of this for a little while.
Yeah, and I think we need to clarify too what we mean by turning in a car, because you can't just you can go back to the bank and say, hey, I can't afford this car anymore. Here, it's called a voluntary repossession, but that has a massively negative impact on your credit. It's not quite as bad as if they repossess it from you. Sort of like if you have a warrant out for your arrest and you make arrangements to turn yourself in versus if the cops have to hunt you down and arrest you, but there's still a very negative impact. And so, I work with people to try and figure out how can we get you out of this car without an impact to your credit, because it's going to take years to recover from that.
Yes. Yes. And I think that I have had someone say, I cannot afford this car. Lindsay, I'm going to bring it to your office. Can you figure it out? I'm like, no, no, because I am not a bank or a car dealership or a tow company. So I'm not going to hold on to your car, but we do have to figure out what to do with it. Because if the only option is repossession, maybe we should do a voluntary repossession. But again, there might be other ways we can do it, and figuring that out, I would probably then be calling you or having them call you, because we have to figure it out, and maybe their budget or their kind of process can be worked out. Can they get a car, deal with the negative equity, and still be able to afford the payment with both of those things considered?
Right. And that's where, when you talked about considering what you call the entire marital pot, which I love that terminology. It makes so much sense. Looking at, okay, well, are we selling a house to get out of the marriage? And is there positive equity in that house where some of that money could then cover the negative equity on that car? And then I can help them sell that car for the best possible price we can get and then purchase something that is less expensive and do it that way, so that, yeah, you're not getting as much cash maybe out of the house, but you're also not getting saddled with this car payment that you can't afford and this negative equity that you're buried under.
Right, because then you're not paying interest on the negative equity. Then you're not, like, there are so many smart things that you can do. None of them are easy, and none of them are like, hooray, I just took all of the equity from my house and paid off a car that I don't have anymore. That's not fun and happy news, but it's better than the alternative, which is tanked credit, which is a car repossessed and you go to drive to work and there's no car in your driveway. There's so many other worse situations than paying it off with cash you thought you were going to get from the sale of your house. But yeah, you have to think big picture in a lot of these situations. And that's really hard when you're already just burdened with the stress and anxiety of just divorce and ending of the relationship. But yeah, we have to think about that a lot.
Yeah, and another option that people don't always realize, we talked a little bit about refinancing. If the negative equity isn't so bad, or maybe it's not a negative equity situation, it's simply of, this is a $600 car payment and I really need something under $500 a month, then you might be able to refinance the car depending on where you are in the loan. And you're just, basically, if you have, let's say you have, 2 years left on this car loan and you're paying $600 a month, if you can refinance it, yes, you're now stretching those payments out again over another 5 years. And there are risks associated with doing that, but it gets that payment down and at least gives you that little bit of breathing room for the next year or so until you get back on your feet. That might also be the lesser of several evils in terms
Right.
of, managing that really high car payment in the near term.
Right, because some people have taken immaculate care of their car. Their plan was to drive it into the ground anyway. So let's just extend out the payment, or maybe they know they've got a trusted car repair person, or they just know it's a good quality car. So extending that payment, the risk is lower than, I don't know, the other situations. But yeah, knowing that as an option for them is lovely. And the other thing I've had people do is they get a co-signer as with their parent. Or their friend or somebody. I don't recommend that if I was representing the co-signer, but but it does happen, and I have had people where they're like, okay, I have to have this car, I have to refinance this car into my name alone, and I can't do it with my credit, or I can't do that with my income, and I need to get somebody to help me out.
And that's, parents will often step up and help a child who is, because it's still their child. So,
Yeah.
I know if I had been in a, bad financial position when I went through my divorce, I know my parents totally would have helped. And they even offered to help if I needed it. Fortunately, I didn't. But, that is, sometimes we have to swallow our pride
Yeah.
and ask for help if we're in a desperate situation like that. And especially if your credit has been damaged by the divorce. I know I have seen, unfortunately, way too many women, and I say women because they're the ones that tend to come to me. I know this can happen, no matter
Both
what
ways.
gender you're
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about in the marriage. But the divorce itself is what tanked their credit because the spouse decided to be a jerk and just stop making payments on things. I've seen it really happen to women who were the weaker financial partner in the relationship. And so
Yeah.
they did rely on their spouse to pay the mortgage and pay for the cars. And, this is one of the things that, and I'm not going to get on my feminist soapbox for too long, but I have to take a little step up on it and talk about, the risks that women have had in, what are considered traditional marriages where the woman stays at home and doesn't have a job outside the home. It can put them in a much more vulnerable financial position if the marriage does not survive.
Yeah. And many times they're the ones that took out the debt, or they're the ones that have the liabilities in their name. And maybe their rent is getting paid or the roof is over their house, but every single debt, credit card, whether it's a small like Banana Republic store card or something, they don't have the money to pay that. And of course they're not going to pay those things versus eat. So their credit is just slowly dwindling. And now they have to refinance a car. It's going to be difficult.
So what should someone do if they find out that their spouse has just stopped making payments on everything just to be a dick. Let's just throw it out there.
Call me. Call me.
Call you.
And we need to get a court date to get them support, the most reasonable support amount that we can get. And unfortunately, what's happening right now in our world is coronavirus they closed the courts for months. Now courts are reopened and they're delayed. So I'm having to tell people, like, I'm so sorry that you're going to endure this and that your credit's going to be really, really damaged. But I can't get you in front of a judge to get you support for, in some counties, it's 3 months. In other counties, it's a year. I can't
Oh
get you
my
in front of
gosh.
it. It's devastating. But what I try to find the positive and say there's still not debtor's jail. So you're not going to go to jail if you don't pay those debts. It's going to affect your ability to do a lot of things, to buy a house, to get different credit, to have access to cash, to refinance a car, to buy a car. All of those things will be affected, but we'll try to work through it. We'll try to build it back up any way we can. But yeah, if they can make minimum payments, I recommend minimum payments to at least keep that going. But if that's not a possibility either, then we just got to let it go and we'll have to pick up the pieces later.
Yeah, and if you find your spouse is the one not making the payment, sometimes I think it might be, and tell me if I'm wrong, but better if you have the money yourself, if you have an income, go ahead and make those payments, even though, you're paying on his car. But if you're on that loan, it's technically your car too. So paying that money now to protect your credit might be the lesser of two evils than versus, just letting the payments go unpaid. Is that something that they could potentially recoup once the divorce actually settles?
Absolutely. In North Carolina, that's something that you could recoup. You could say, I've made so much payments towards the principal, so I've made this car valued more or a higher value, or I've paid against the debt on whether it's their car, their house, their credit cards. Those are payments that would be counted. So the court would want to know, how much was your debt when you separated and how much have you paid towards that debt? So yeah, they would get credit. I would definitely recommend it if they have the financial ability to do it, whether or not if it's in their name and it's something they'd be liable for. I would say you should do that to protect yourself.
And because of COVID, the banks know that this is an extraordinarily difficult time. And so somebody can call up their bank, especially if you finance through the manufacturer's captive finance company. So Honda Financial Services, Hyundai Financial Services, call them up and explain the situation and say, is there anything we can do? Can we restructure my loan? How can we do this so that I don't end up getting this car repossessed? Because trust me, the bank does not want to own your car either, because they're likely going to lose their butt on it when they take it to auction and try and sell it. Yep. And so a lot of the banks right now are doing a good job to understand that we are living in extraordinarily difficult times. And they would rather, very much like when people end up going through the foreclosure process, the bank, a lot of them will really try and work with you to figure out, okay, how can we restructure the payments so that you can keep this vehicle and we don't have to repossess it, because that's a lose-lose situation. And they don't want that either. So it never hurts to ask.
I agree. I just think that the next thing that you should do after you're doing that, whether it's your house or your car, is to just get a second, glance over, whether that's a friend or a family member or a lawyer or LeeAnn or somebody, to say, okay, here's the new terms of the loan, or here's the modified terms of my loan. Does this look okay? Because I've had so many people that did do this, like coronavirus, I have to either defer my loan or I have to see if I can restructure. And they've gotten burned where they have a deferment, no payments for 3 months, but now those 3 months are all due on the 4th month. Or,
right.
so just make sure if you're talking to the bank, they are going to try to help you, but maybe that help you is temporary help, and then it's going to cause long-term damage. So just make sure that it's stressful and it's sometimes embarrassing, but we're all here to help people. That's why we do what we do. So give us the document, let us talk it through with you, make sure it really is the best kind of deal for you and that it is worth that kind of small-term gain for long-term gain, or just small-term gain for then long-term misery. I don't know. We should look at it.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk for a minute about, so we're talking about sometimes the spouse being a complete jerk. So
Yeah.
what happens? Because I have seen this. It wasn't one of my clients, but it was a friend of a friend. So what happens if like the spouse damages the vehicle in question? Because, I think we've all seen or at least heard of, the angry spouse, usually the wife, taking a sledgehammer to the car because the spouse was cheating on them or whatnot. So what happens in those situations?
That makes me think of that song where it's like I dug my keys into the side of his pretty
Right,
little souped-up
Shania
car.
Twain.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
If a country song has been written about it, it happens a lot.
It's not untrue. So this good or bad, I don't know how you in your situation would term this, but if it's marital property, that means it's your property and you can do with it what you like. So if that means you would like to take a sledgehammer to your property, you can do that and the police cannot stop you. Are you maybe a danger to humans, or are you maybe mentally not stable? Those are other questions, but can you destroy your own property? You could. And that's kind of crazy, but you could do that. And I'm not sure that the police can arrest you because you're damaging your own property. Your spouse would be like, that's my property, but it's both of yours. So that's another transition too. I've had so many people talk to me about like, well, I left the car when I left because it's in his name or it's in her name. And I'm like, well, I mean, y'all are married. It's yours too, but it's in their name. Well, no, that's actually not true. It's both of you. It's both of your cars until the court or you guys agree to say, now this is yours and now this is mine. It is both of yours. It's 100% yours and it's 100% theirs. So
And that's where the marital property laws of each individual state supersede whatever the title of the car says. And that I know that can differ between states. So
yeah.
that's, North Carolina. Is that what's meant by community property state?
See, people ask me that community property state, and I don't use that term here, so I don't know if that is the law here. That's definitely not how I've ever described it or had it described to me. Someone did just say that about Texas, but again, I'm not licensed in Texas. I know nothing
Yeah,
about that.
Wisconsin, they use that term a lot. I just remember that from back when I lived in Wisconsin. So that may be a term that's used legally in some states and not others. But basically up there, it meant that, if you're married, everything belongs to both of you.
And that's pretty much the same here, but what we have to decipher in a case that comes to my office is it, of all the property that's here, is it marital, is it separate, or is it both, or is it a little bit of both? So is this car purchased during the marriage and paid for by money that was earned during the marriage? It's going to be marital property. So if that's all true, or you're both on the deed or sorry, title, or you're only one's on the title, it's still marital property. You can be driving around the Toyota in her name and there's no issue with that. So yeah, I think that's important because I think sometimes that's used as a manipulation, like I'm going to keep this car or I'm going to take the car that has the higher payment because it's in my name, although I don't have the money. So maybe we shouldn't do that. But I've seen
Yeah, well, that sounds like a dumb idea anyway.
yes,
But
yes. So
so
yeah,
well, we definitely do not recommend taking a sledgehammer to any of the property involved in this situation.
thank you for clarifying that. I should have. No sledgehammers. Bad
No sledgehammers,
plan.
because all you're doing is damaging the value of that
Yeah,
car and lowering the marital pot of value anyway. So you're hurting yourself as much as you're hurting the spouse that you're really pissed
right.
off at
I'll clarify.
anyway.
The
So
police might not be able to arrest you, but there's going to be consequences. There's just, it's not
right,
like
and
consequence free.
and I have to stand up for the car because, the car is innocent in this situation and you shouldn't disrespect the car. But maybe I'm a little
Right.
more attached to cars than most people. But
That's okay.
so
That's okay.
I know you're not an insurance agent, and I get asked insurance questions all the time, and I'm like, I'm not an insurance agent. But
Right.
I know that sometimes that can, because the insurance is tied to the cars, that's yet another thing that you kind of have to untie all of those knots when you get divorced. I know that there's probably some some issues regarding that you have encountered?
Yeah, so one of the things, as I talked about changing the title, and you put a timeline on that, and then in North Carolina, you're separated for a year before you can get a divorce. So a lot of families I'm working with, they just got separated, and we're going to try and figure out all this property right now, so that that whole year of separation, they're financially separated already. It's as if they're divorced financially and liability wise and all of that. So one of the reasons that's important is if you are married to your spouse and they are driving a car and the insurance is in both of your names and they get into a car accident where someone is either severely injured or maybe killed, now you as the spouse who is very upset and trying to divorce this other person could be liable both by your insurance. You're liable because you're both insuring this car, or you're liable because the separation agreement hasn't kind of separated you from this person. So their actions can significantly affect you. So what I try to get people to do is to modify the insurance as soon as possible, especially if the car is going to be titled in their name. Get off that insurance. They should get their own insurance. You should get your own insurance. Something to consider. You could do that as quickly as possible, or sometimes you're going to save hundreds if not thousands of dollars if you're still under the policy where you have your house and then multiple car discount. There's so many other things to consider, but I say if you're divorced, you should get off of their insurance as soon as possible. It's probably not worth the $40 a month savings, because you could be liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars if they accidentally kill someone, especially if they're an alcoholic or on drugs or something like that, where you're
Or
like,
just a really crappy driver.
that's also a possibility. So the insurance part, I think people don't think about. They think about, okay, insurance is X amount of dollars per month. It's cheaper if we just stay on it together. Let's just stay on this long term. We don't need to file a separation agreement until we've been separated a year. And I say, that's not true. Let's sign a separation agreement as soon as possible. Let's get you kind of on your feet with your own insurance, kind of pull you up by your bootstraps. Let's move on with this. And then you're not connected to them liability wise.
Right. And, if the best case scenario happens and you do work through your issues and decide not to proceed with the divorce, guess what? It's really easy to put it all back together. It's actually easier to put that stuff back together than it is to take it apart.
Yes. Yes. And I think it's overwhelming when I'm talking to clients about, okay, and now you have to change your insurance, and now you have to change the title, and now you have to refinance the car. Like the checklist as you're going through a divorce is astronomical, and it's sometimes paralyzing. But just knowing these little things and the reasoning behind it is usually motivating in and of itself. Like, oh, of course I want to get off their insurance. Of course I'll pay that extra $10 a month if I can, or $50 a month if I can, to have it on my car in my insurance. It's a lot better sometimes.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I had to get my own because when I separated from my first husband, I bought a house in South Carolina, so I actually was changing states. So I had to change my insurance anyway. So I didn't even think about the potential joint liability issues. It was just more of a, okay, yeah, I'm moving, I'm buying a house in another state. I have to move my insurance to the other state because insurance doesn't go across state lines. So it was just one of the many things that I had on my checklist, because then I was also buying this house. So
I think the other thing, if someone that's listening is the jerk of the spouse, to sometimes
so all you jerks out there, listen up. I don't have any listeners that are jerks. Lindsey, come on, my listeners are great.
No, they're okay. If you have a friend who is a jerk, sometimes people are like, well, forget them. I'm angry. I'm mad. I'm going to take them off my insurance, our insurance, however they want to play it. Now they're driving a car uninsured. Forget them. That's also a bad plan, because now you are married to someone who has no insurance. And let's say they get into a car accident and hurt someone. You're still married to them. They're uninsured. And now your marriage, your marital pot, is at jeopardy because there's an uninsured accident. So bad plan. Don't do that. I know it feels like you're in power and you just cut them off, but that's a really bad plan.
So it's not just property that is owned jointly in the marriage. Also, legal liability is also part of that joint pot, whether you like it or not, simply because you're married. So whatever one person does, the other person is also sort of responsible for.
Yeah. Yes. Like I said, it's 100% theirs and it's 100% yours. So
For
Be
better or for
careful.
worse. Is that what they mean by for better or for worse?
It sounds like it's for worse right now as we talk about it.
Well, so we've had some really good pieces of advice here. So I want to try and summarize, ways that you can avoid these problems, hopefully before you find yourself in the midst of all of this mess. My number one piece of advice is don't get divorced. But,
Amen.
go to
Yes.
therapy, marriage counseling, exhaust every possibility. Marriage is not easy at all. So even the
No.
best marriages probably need a little help every now and then, because just putting up with another human being for years and years on end is just not easy.
No, I agree with that. I agree.
But it sounds like also if you feel like your marriage is rocky, or you have any, little lingering kind of doubts, the butterflies in your stomach, don't go out and buy a car.
Yes, please don't do that right before you're going to separate. It just muddies the waters.
Yeah. And I tend to recommend to my clients, because they often ask me, well, should we put the car in both names or should it only be in one name? And I said, well, that's if you have to both be on the loan, then you both have to be on the title. The bank determines that. We don't get a decision there. But if you've got that flexibility of, you can afford the car on your own income and your own credit, that's a marital decision, but putting it in just your name can make it logistically easier. Heaven forbid if the marriage breaks up, you don't have to go through the hassle of retitling the car and getting the loans separated. Or if you just, in a few years, you want to sell the car, trade it in on something else, now your spouse doesn't have to take time off of work or whatever and be there to sign all the dang paperwork. So it's
Yeah.
just cleaner. If you can buy the car yourself and you're the only person on the loan and the title, it's just easier all around.
Yes. Yes.
And you said, if your spouse just stops making the payments to be a jerk, if you can go ahead and keep making those payments so that your credit isn't trashed, and make sure your lawyer knows this so that you can get credit for that money that was paid during the separation time. Did I say that right?
Yeah, so even if it's in both of your names or your name alone, try to make sure the payments are made, because you'll get credit for it and it will help your credit. So it's a win-win. Sometimes it's a struggle, and sometimes you need to manage where that payment's coming from or what sacrifices you're going to make. But my advice would be keep making the payments. Yes.
Sounds good. And if there's any doubt, take the crappier car if it's the one with the better equity position. Because you're going to
Yes.
save yourself a lot of trouble, even if it's not the car that you want. You've got to just look at the money and not anything else.
Yes, absolutely.
Unless it doesn't work for you. Like if you have 3 kids, his little 2-seater sports car is probably not going to work for you in that situation. But,
Right? Absolutely. Absolutely.
And finally, no sledgehammers.
Oh gosh, hallelujah. Please don't do that.
Don't scratch the car. Don't sledgehammer the car. Do not set the car on fire. Preserve the property.
And your sanity, because it will
your
look
sanity.
really, really wacky if you've done that.
Yeah, get yourself a punching bag, go to one of those places that, where you can take sledgehammers to junk cars. Those places do exist, so you can pay to sledgehammer somebody else's car, not have to worry about it to get out some of those emotions. And most importantly, get yourself a good lawyer.
Hey, call me.
Well, that's a great segue. How do people get in touch with you, Lindsey?
So the best way to contact myself or the associate Catherine at my office is to call us at 980-272-1365. We'll schedule you for a consultation. Sometimes people just get a consultation even if they're not ready to make the next step and get a divorce. It's just kind of a learning legal education for that first hour consultation. So you'll leave with the knowledge of, is the grass really greener, or is this a nightmare that I'm about to do? So it's kind of a self-educating process for us to tell you can make now the best decision for your life after you've consulted with us. And whether that's hiring us or whether that's marriage counseling, we're happy to help either way. So we're not pro-divorce. We're just pro-family and pro trying to help people do the best thing for their life that they've decided is the best thing. So we're not high pressure. We're nothing of the sort. So yeah, give us a call. We'll schedule a consult and meet with you for an hour, and then you can decide what's next. And if it's a specific question about a vehicle, we can schedule a 15 or 30-minute consultation, or I might tell you, call LeeAnn.
Yeah, because if they want to just ask questions about their car, I'll totally do that for free. So
Yeah.
no big deal. Well, what's your
Absolutely.
website, Lindsey, in case people just want to go peruse and learn a little more about you and your firm?
So we are www.easterlingfamilylaw.com, and give us a call or look us up on our website, and we'll schedule with you as soon as possible.
Sounds great. And I'll put that URL in the description for the podcast, so for when it gets published, people will have that too. Well, thank you so much, Lindsey. I know I've learned so much from you about how the law works, and just it's a lot of things that I didn't really understand myself about marital property and sledgehammers and things like that. So I really appreciate you. You've been a great guest. And folks, until next time, no sledgehammering cars, try not to get divorced, and drive safely. We're out of here.
The Straight Shift podcast is copyright LeeAnn Shattuck, the Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of LeeAnn Shattuck or the Car Chick.